Hi, I'm Karl Haro von Mogel from the Biofortified blog at www.biofortified.org/blog, an independent group science blog about biology, plants, genetics, and agriculture. Genetically engineered crops have been grown and consumed in the United States for over 16 years and are estimated to be present in about 3/4 of processed foods. One of the most hotly debated issues about GE foods is the issue of labeling, whether the current scheme of voluntary labeling works or whether we should have mandatory labeling. On November 6, voters in California will have an opportunity to vote on a ballot proposition that aims to address that question, Proposition 37. From the description, Proposition 37 requires that foods sold in stores that contain genetically engineered ingredients be required to carry labels disclosing this information. It also prohibits marketing such food or other processed food as natural and exempts some classes of food such as alcohol, organic products, and restaurant food from these labeling requirements. The state estimates that the fiscal impact will be an increase in annual state costs from a few $100,000 to over $1 million to regulate the labeling of genetically engineered foods. Various claims have been made about this proposition, such as how much it will cost farmers and food producers, and thus consumers, to comply with the provisions should they become law. The proponents claim it will cost consumers absolutely nothing, while the opponents claim it could impact consumers by up to $400 a year. Proponents perceive these foods as risky, while opponents point to the existing research on safety. Where does the truth lie in these claims? Are these risky foods that must be labeled, or is this a risky proposition? To find out, I talked to Stacy Malkan, who directs the campaign that supports Proposition 37, and Kathy Fairbanks, who directs the campaign against it. The interviews were conducted separately, and you'll hear them back to back. Okay, now I'm talking to Stacy Malkan from the Yes on 37 California Right to Know campaign. Stacy, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Carl.
Sure. So, in your words, what's the importance of Proposition 37?
Well, Proposition 37 is very simple. It's about our fundamental right to know what's in our food. And I think there's so much passion for this ballot initiative here in California because food is such a sacred part of our lives. It matters so deeply to all of us. And people are saying we absolutely have a right to know if our food comes from nature or if it was genetically engineered in a lab to contain foreign genes that haven't been in the food system before. And genetically engineered foods are already labeled in 61 other countries, but we haven't been able to get the information here in the U.S. because of the huge lobby power that Monsanto and the chemical companies have. They've been able to stop federal and state legislation, even though there have been many attempts to get labels nationally in 19 states. So now in California, we're taking the question directly to the people through the Citizens Initiative process, and it's truly a huge grassroots movement against the world's largest agrochemical companies and also processed food companies that are opposing this initiative.
Okay. So I want to ask you a quick question about one of the things you just said about between foods that came from nature versus something made in a lab with genes that we haven't eaten before.
Correct.
But aren't there ways to introduce genes that we haven't eaten before in combinations that don't exist in nature that aren't genetic engineering? Do people have a right to know about those ways of modifying as well?
Well, the Proposition 37 relates specifically to genetically engineered foods, transgenics, foods that are in the system now. For example, the new sweet corn that's on shelves now at Walmart, Monsanto's BT sweet corn. It's been engineered to contain BT toxin, as well as it was also engineered to be a Roundup-ready crop. So those are the two types of genetic engineering that are primarily used in the food system. And no, those foods have not existed in nature before. It's the same sweet corn, but it contains genes that are engineered between a bacteria and a corn to produce insecticides. And people want to know. They want these foods to be labeled like they're labeled in most of the industrialized world.
Okay, right. But my question was about what about the right to know about other methods of genetic modification that can also introduce genes and change them in ways that don't occur in nature?
Well, just, the World Health Organization says that genetically engineered foods are different from conventional foods. We should have mandatory safety testing. And so that's what we're concerned about here. We're talking about the BT corn, the Roundup Ready corn, soy, cotton that's become so prevalent in the U.S. food system that people want to be labeled. It's different from conventional breeding. I know that's gone on for thousands of years, and there are lots of different ways of confusing the definition of genetic engineering. But this proposition is very clear and straightforward that it requires genetically engineered foods of the types I described to be labeled.
Okay, yeah, so I understand that about the distinction of what is included in the proposition and what isn't. I had sort of questions about this later on, but since we're talking about this, I might as well ask them now. But if there's a way to introduce a gene that we haven't eaten before, its products, the protein it makes, and in a way that doesn't occur in nature, do you, yes or no, believe that people have a right to know about that new gene or gene product, even if it's not made through genetic engineering?
Well, I certainly believe that people have a right to know, and also that, we ought to look at safety testing of foods that introduce new and novel proteins. The National Academy of Sciences has said that you can get unintended effects from these foods, and they can have health impacts. Now, of course, the question about safety testing is different. Proposition 37 does not address that. It's just about labeling. It's just saying that foods would contain a label that would say partially produced with genetic engineering if it's a processed food. And again, we're talking about corn, soy, sugar beets, canola, cotton primarily. Those are the genetically engineered crops that would be labeled. A few crops, but they're widely used in processed foods. So partially produced with genetic engineering would be on the label of processed foods, and then whole foods, of which, as you probably know, there are only a few right now in the food system, would have to carry a label on the bin that says genetically engineered.
Okay. So,
for example, the salmon that's in the pipeline for approval, which is the salmon genetically engineered with a type of eel to make it grow twice as fast, that would be labeled under Prop 37. And it should be labeled. I mean, people want to know. We get to know lots of other things about our food. For example, if salmon is wild caught or farm raised, or what area of the country it comes from. It's absolutely relevant if it's a different type of salmon that hasn't been in the food system before.
Okay. So let's say you're a store owner and you have a bin of sweet corn in your produce department. So what would you have to do to comply with the proposition if it becomes law?
You would have to put a sign on the bin that says genetically engineered.
No matter what sweet corn it is?
No, if it was genetically engineered.
Then
so if you're carrying Monsanto's sweet corn, which Walmart has said that they're carrying, but of course we wouldn't know that now at this point without product testing, which corn at Walmart. So they would have to label the genetically engineered corn genetically engineered, and the law doesn't specify, what the label needs to look like beyond that it just needs to say genetically engineered, so it could literally be, a sign taped on the bin.
So then how would the store owner know which bins to label and which not to label?
Well, they would have to find out from their suppliers.
And then so the suppliers say we get all these, we buy sweet corn from farmers here or there, and it all goes into one big batch.
Yeah, that's a terrible idea, because then you'll contaminate the entire U.S. supply of sweet corn. And in fact, that is what's happened with some types of crops. So this would require, store owners to, like Walmart. Now, some big supermarkets have said they are not going to carry the genetically engineered corn. Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, General Mills wouldn't take it. So they do know where food's coming from, and some stores are saying we're not going to take this corn. Now, Walmart has said they would take it, and so it's then their responsibility to label it and to know which of their corn is coming from which supply. It's not really that much to ask. It's literally asking them to have a piece of paper saying, this corn is not genetically engineered, or putting a label on the bin of corn that is.
But isn't it more than just the label that's being put on the bin? Wouldn't there have to be a whole lot of tracking and even segregating of the genetically engineered and the non-genetically engineered at the distributors, and going back to who they purchase it from? I mean, wouldn't there be costs involved in that?
Well, it's a very smart idea to track where genetically engineered food is going in the food system. And, there are costs involved in many ways in genetic engineering, and let me give you an example. There was a recent report from the USDA, a panel report, saying that organic farms are getting contaminated with genetically engineered seeds. That's a problem for farmers. Some whole industries have actually lost exports. This happened to the rice industry when rice in the southern U.S. got contaminated inadvertently with genetically engineered seed, and they could no longer export to Europe or other markets. Now, who pays for that? So the USDA is looking at this question of who should pay for farms getting contaminated, and deciding that maybe we ought to look at a taxpayer-funded insurance program to foot the bill, not going back to who produced the seeds in the first place, Monsanto. So my earlier point is that these companies have had enormous influence over the process, over being able to say that safety studies are not required, they're not responsible for contaminating fields that get inadvertently contaminated. Now they're spending $40 million in California to try to confuse voters about a simple labeling initiative and using all sorts of tricks. I mean, this campaign they've now had to take 2 ads off the air because they've outright lied. I mean, it's just, they got accused by Stanford University of misidentifying their top scientists. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the world's largest professional association of nutritionists, put out a press release saying they're misleading voters. They misrepresented the group's position in the voter guide that went to 11 million voters. So there's lots of tricks going on to try to confuse people in California, and I think that's really important to point out, because what are they so afraid of? If genetic engineering is so great, why not just label it and give consumers a choice? I believe that's because they don't have actually any consumer benefits to the products. And so they're trying to hide the information. It's not the way the market is supposed to work.
Yeah, I mean, at least for the traits that there are out right now, there are very few, at least in the case of direct benefits. I mean, there is, for like BT corn, there are lower amounts of fungal infection because there are fewer insect bites and thus lower amounts of toxic compounds produced by fungi. But that's a really hard thing to put on a food label to sort of advocate for genetically engineered crops. I understand that argument.
That's true. In some ways, BT can have some advantages, but it's also having disadvantages because the worms are becoming resistant. And in any case, it's not a consumer benefit. But, right, I mean, we could agree on that. What's the benefit to consumers of eating corn that it kills bugs? But, in the beginning of biotech, the first biotech product, the Flavor Saver tomato, was labeled. It had a sticker. It had a brochure at the point of purchase that had an 800 number that consumers could call if they had any questions. Now, so that's how the industry started out. It was transparent. And actually, the market responded really well. People bought that tomato. Some stores actually even had to ration it. It was very popular at first. Ultimately, it didn't offer the benefits that it promised. And so
they didn't use a very good tomato to save the flavor from. So it was kind of a breeding problem.
To save flavor. That's what was strange about it. It was engineered to not rot. So it was, it was marketed in ways that weren't accurate. And the market responded as you might expect they would. Hey, that product's not what it doesn't have the benefits they say it does, and so it didn't work. But my point is transparency is a market value, and that's how things are supposed to work.
So you talked about some of the things that the No on 37 campaign said, and we were talking a little bit about like potential costs involved in tracking the foods in order to comply with labeling requirements. But your campaign has maintained that the labels would cost consumers nothing. I think your recent ad that you just put out said it wouldn't cost a dime.
Right.
But so let me ask you my first question about that. So first, the state of California determined that in the voter information that it could cost taxpayers a few $100,000 to up to over $1 million per year to enforce the proposition. I guess my first question there is, where will that money come from?
So if you divide the worst case scenario, if you divided that out by California taxpayers, it would cost about 3 cents per person. So it would come from the existing tax fund. It's a very low amount, and we absolutely believe it won't even be anywhere near that worst case, because it's just a very simple law and approach. And in fact, there's an independent report done by an economist at Emory named Joanna Shepard Bailey, who looked at the costs all around, said the costs to the state are going to be trivial. The cost to consumers likely to be nothing. The reason is because the law gives companies 18 months to change their labels, and they typically change their labels in that time frame anyway, and almost never do they pass on those costs to consumers for various reasons, because of competitive pricing. Changing labels and labeling is what companies do. It's a cost of doing business, and they don't pass it on to consumers.
Okay, but I'm from California. I'm a native to California, even though I'm in Wisconsin right now, and I still paid attention to the budget crises that California has had. But even though on a per-person basis, even $1 million doesn't sound like a whole lot, but that's still got to come from somewhere, from some other program that won't be able to get that money.
Well, California is a huge state. It doesn't set up any new bureaucracy,
with a bad credit rating too.
Offices. It would be regulated under the Department of Health, and they would just take this on as one of the duties they already do. That's why we think it won't even be anywhere near that top cost.
Okay. So you mentioned relabeling, and yeah, companies do periodically relabel their products. And they have to change their ads and stuff like that. But there'd also still be tracking and record keeping. So that would at least be required by this proposition. Wouldn't that also introduce costs in the very least?
Well, people are saying that it's such a burden to create a piece of paper, but I just don't believe it. Yes, they would have to know if their food is genetically engineered or not. And as I was saying earlier, that's a really smart thing for companies to know. What's the sourcing of their food and where is it coming from? But we're literally talking about a statement from a supplier. So that's a pretty common sort of system in the food supply, keeping statements from suppliers about where things come from and what's in them. Companies have to do it in other ways. It's just being made out to be some terrible burden, but in fact it's just a very simple, straightforward system.
Right, but your campaign has said it will cost consumers nothing, but yet there will be some costs involved.
But how does it cost consumers for companies to have a statement from their supplier? How does it cost farmers to produce a piece of paper? It's just there's nothing there to prop up these costs. But, it's one of the biggest arguments they're making. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because they know it's actually the only of their arguments that truly convinces consumers. So let me give you an example of what this campaign is up to. They put out a report many months ago by a consulting firm that has no economic expertise called Northbridge. They're best known for opposing recycling laws and bottle bill laws for the soda industry. They put together a report based on a completely faulty premise, considering Prop 37 as a ban and not a label. They come up with a cost of $400 a year, and they put it in a report. They send it to reporters across the state. Nobody covered this report because they knew it was a joke. But unfortunately, you don't have to tell the truth in political ads on TV. We've all seen the political ads, and I think we kind of know that, but yet the ads are somehow effective. So the 400 number is now all over the TV ads. Now the press is covering it as if it might be true without looking into the facts. It's based on nothing. It is truly an invented figure, but they're advertising it all over the state. So I do hope that you asked Kathy Fairbanks about that.
Oh, yeah, I will be asking about the way that was calculated, certainly.
Yeah, it's a completely bogus report based on totally false premises by a company that has no economic expertise.
So it seems to me, though, that it would be somewhere between 0 and 400 per person, because I don't agree that it would be 0. You asked, what's the cost of a piece of paper, a statement from a supplier, but last week you participated in a discussion with the Mercury News. It was a web-based discussion, and you said, when asked about why the proposition exempts restaurant served food, you said requiring labeling of restaurant food would require a complicated level of record keeping. You have to track all the ingredients in a meal. But how is it that it can be complicated and that it would take a lot of records to be kept, and that would be an issue and a reason to exclude restaurant food. But then with other food that's not served in a restaurant would not cost anything.
Because if you're eating a restaurant meal, there's not a list of ingredients to it.
But the chefs know what they put in it.
So it's not the same thing as keeping track of food that has labels. I mean, restaurant food, alcohol, other things that don't have labels are exempt from Prop 37, yes.
And also organic food, which does have labels.
Yes, organic food, because it can't contain genetically engineered food in the first place.
Well, it can, but
crops
it's not.
That are not genetically engineered are also exempt, and so that's where the statement from the supplier comes in, where you just say, I'm using food that's genetically engineered, or I'm not using food that's genetically engineered.
So, I mean, about the statement from a supplier, what if they're mistaken? What if they bought from a farmer, the farmer said, oh, no, I'm not using GMOs, I'm using Roundup Ready, and they didn't know what they were talking about, and then you get basically a product that says produced, it doesn't have the label, but it was accidentally produced from genetically engineered crops. Wouldn't that lead to basically a misbranding one way or the other because it's about statements and not an actual testing?
You know, I could just as easily say, what if Monsanto has a warehouse full of data that genetically engineered foods are really harmful? I mean, look, this is what we're talking about here.
What?
Is we have a right to know what's in our food. It is not a lot to ask for farmers to create a piece of paper to say whether they're growing genetically engineered crops or not. I mean, I'm just saying that some of the examples we're hearing, you could just easily say, you know, what if the sky would fall? I mean, it's just...
I don't think that was an unreasonable question, because, if a food does contain a genetically engineered food, but one of the people in the chain didn't think it did, and they just said, oh, yeah, it doesn't have it, then it would just be a statement. It wouldn't actually be telling people, it wouldn't actually be, because there is, I'm not saying that there should be a requirement to test, but if there was a label that said it is or isn't, if it's just based upon statements and not testing, couldn't that lead to misbranding?
Well, it is a system of trust in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
However, you know, I think there can also be checks and balances on that system if people did want to do testing. But it doesn't require testing, that's true, and some other countries do. And this was intended to be a simpler approach because it's based on intent. Are you intending to use genetically engineered foods or are you not? And, you know, I think the bottom line on this, on labeling, on costs, on how companies are going to respond, is that companies tend to label honestly. They do. I mean, they put the calories on there, they put the fat content,
mm-hmm.
they put the allergy contents. They do it honestly, as far as we know, without problems, whether or not they think that's going to be desirable for consumers. So, you know, that's what this is. It's an extension of labeling, which companies do. They don't pass the costs on to consumers. You know, the whole organic system is based on statements and suppliers, and that works fine. It's a common sort of mechanism for keeping track of how things work in the food system. So you can say a lot of things. And, I mean, I've heard both sides argued, sort of what you were getting at in your question right there. What if we can't trust them? So I've heard, you know, the opposition argue that this is so burdensome for farmers, they can't possibly do it. But then they will also argue it's not burdensome enough for the foreign countries. How can we trust them? Well, now, so that's arguing both sides of an issue. Now, there's not a lot of genetically engineered foods coming to the U.S. from other countries. So, if they really, almost none. It's mostly grown in the United States, canola from Canada. We're the main producers of genetic engineering at this point.
Brazil? Brazil has a lot.
So, yeah, some from Brazil.
Australia.
But we're the main the producers and exporters of the main genetically engineered crops and food, which is corn and soy.
Okay, so I've just got a couple other questions for you, if you've got time to keep talking to me. You were talking about the science, about, what if Monsanto has some warehouse with all this scary data? And I follow the science about genetically engineered crops pretty closely, and it seems like the Yes on 37 campaign has sort of amplified the relative risks of genetically engineered crops. I think out of proportion. I mean, it's even written into the proposition at the very beginning about potential risks. But when the weight of the scientific literature shows that these foods are not inherently risky, it makes me wonder why, if this is about the right to know, does the Yes on 37 campaign run a campaign that basically trying to scare people about, oh no, what if Monsanto's got some secret pile of data that shows it's harmful? Why try to get people afraid like that?
Well, let me clarify that statement. I don't know what kind of science they have, and they have, because they hold the patents, been able to do the science and really decide what gets published. And some of it is public. Here's what we've said about the science. There are peer-reviewed studies showing raising concerns, links to allergies, certain organ toxicities, particularly liver and kidney, some immune system issues. Those are mostly short-term studies. They need to be followed up. Almost all the science that has been produced that is public are short-term studies. So if you authentically want to answer the question about what are the health effects, you would do longer-term studies.
Well, there was a review of 24 long-term and multi-generational feeding studies that was published even last year. I mean, you can point to a couple.
There are a lot of problems with that review. From the scientists that I talked to have looked at that and said a lot of data was left out. I mean, there's a lot of he said, she said around the science. What we need is independent review, government review, mandated studies. That's what the World Health Organization says. That's what the American Medical Association just recently said, that there should be mandatory required safety studies. So why aren't there? Well, because the government has taken a position that genetically engineered foods are the same as regular foods. But FDA's own scientists at the time disagreed with that position. It was 20 years ago. The law was written by a former Monsanto attorney. It's out of
Sounds like you've been reading Jeffrey Smith.
Well, it was out of line with. No, that's a fact. That's a fact.
I know. I'm just saying these are some talking points there, but I certainly agree that there are.
That that's a fact. That it was written by Michael Taylor, who was a Monsanto guy. I mean, the point is, the FDA position is out of line with global scientific consensus. That's the World Health Organization, United Nations, sets the policy of global science-based standards and says mandatory safety studies should be required. So the U.S. position makes no sense, and it's just, it's time. Americans want to know about this. They're demanding to know about this. That's what we're seeing here in California, is a demand for the right to know. I think this won't be the last of it. Other states are already talking about going forward with citizens' initiatives, regardless of what happens here, although here we do have a very good chance to win. So, it's going to be up to the people to decide, as it should be, because we're the ones buying and eating this food.
Okay. So, rather than continue on this question anymore, I just want to ask you a couple quick last ones, and then we'll call it an interview. So, I meant to ask near the beginning, who's funding the campaign for Proposition 37, and what is their interest in the ballot measure?
So Prop 37 has funding from many California businesses in the organic and natural food industry. We're funded in large part by individuals. There have been over 10,000 individual donors who've given online. And that's the Organic Consumers Fund funding. I have a call coming in, so it's clicking. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
That's why you're hearing delays. So the funding comes from a wide range of individuals and businesses. A lot of it does come from inside the state. And if you look at the other side, you'll see that almost all the funding comes from out of state, from the big chemical and processed food companies and even from companies from Europe. 4 of the leading funders are companies from Germany and Switzerland. That's Syngenta, BASF, Bayer, and Nestle. And they're not allowed to actually even grow GMOs in those countries. Yet they're spending millions in California to try to tell us we don't have a right to know.
Interesting. So I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the Organic Consumers Fund. Ronnie Cummins, who directs the Organic Consumers Association and Fund, wrote an open letter to the organic community in which he said that the burning question for us all then becomes how and how quickly can we move healthy organic products from a 4.2% market niche to the dominant force in American food and farming. And then he said the first step is to change our labeling laws. I mean, is this, you mentioned a lot of basically food companies that are selling competing products are pushing for this labeling measure. I mean, is there an economic interest from the people who are, aside from individual donations, certainly got a lot of grassroots support, but I mean, is there an economic interest from some of the larger donors?
Well, that question was put actually to some of the larger donors at a press conference this week, and these CEOs said, actually, no, they stand to lose market share with labeling. And the reason why is because organic foods right now are the only real alternative to genetically engineered foods. It's the only way that you can know for sure that you're not eating GMOs is to buy organic. If there's labeling, if some companies choose to move toward conventional crops, then obviously those choices would expand, and consumers could then have a wider range of choice. One would presumably assume with lower prices involved that they might then choose.
It's always possible. It's even possible that because so many processed foods contain genetically engineered foods, that the sort of opposite effect could even happen where the labels show up everywhere and then people become desensitized to it, much like Proposition 65 did. I certainly remember everywhere I went just said 65 warning everywhere, and so I didn't even pay any more attention to it except to laugh.
Well, it's true that could also be the effect. I mean, we don't know how the market is going to respond, and that's kind of why I wonder why so much hysteria around, and I mean we're just seeing a lot of misinformation and a lot of untruths, as I said, from the other side. For example, a TV ad that has newspaper endorsements against us, and the big logo of the San Francisco Examiner, which actually endorsed us. They had to reshoot their first ad because they misrepresented Stanford University. They actually quoted FDA in a campaign mailer with something FDA never said and put the agency's logo on it, making it look like they're opposed to Prop 37. So I just wonder, if they have such a case to be made, why are they pulling so many dirty tricks? Why are they confusing voters in those ways if they have an actual good case to make here? I think that consumers want to know. I think that producers of products have a responsibility to tell consumers what they want to know, and then the market sorts it out.
So finally, what is something you think that has been lost in the discussion over this ballot measure, something that both your campaign and the campaign opposed to the proposition agree upon?
Well, they say that they do agree with the consumer's right to know. And in fact, their biggest funder is Monsanto. And Monsanto did run ads in Europe supporting GMO labeling. This was back in the 90s. They did a big series of print ads. And their ads, if you read them, read like the talking points of the Yes on 37 campaign. They say consumers want to know about biotechnology, and they have a right to know. And we support labels, and we're proud of our products. They actually had they provided numbers of opposing groups like Greenpeace, and saying, if you want to hear the opposing side, call these folks up and ask them what they think about genetic engineering. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Why not? Be open and proud of what you're producing, provide the information to consumers, and let consumers decide. So that's something that we agree on with Monsanto.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stacy, for your time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and good luck in the final week of your campaign.
Thanks. Okay. Bye.
Bye. That was Stacy Malkan from the California Right to Know Yes on 37 campaign at www.carightoknow.org. Next, we're going to talk to the opposition to the proposition. Now I'm talking to Kathy Fairbanks from the No on Proposition 37 campaign. Kathy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much for having me, Carl.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating in this discussion. So, in your words, what is the problem with Proposition 37?
Well, Proposition 37 is not a simple labeling measure as proponents claim, not by a long shot. It's actually much more complicated, and it's poorly drafted and will lead to a number of negative consequences for Californians, who will be the ones left to deal with its aftermath should it pass. First and foremost, the measure was written by a very well-known trial lawyer here in California. His name is James Wheaton. He drafted Proposition 37, and it is a measure that gives trial lawyers a new avenue to file lawsuits against grocery retailers, food companies, and family farmers. The measure also is going to increase state taxpayer costs by more than $1 million a year here in California, and our state is flat broke. There are actually 3 other tax increase measures on the ballot here in California, along with Proposition 37, because the state budget is in such dire straits. So it costs state taxpayers money. It will lead to meritless lawsuits filed by lawyers. All of this is going to increase grocery bills for California consumers by up to $400 a year. And for what? For a measure that doesn't provide any health or safety benefits to consumers and actually exempts 2/3 of the foods that we eat every day. So, no matter which way you come at Prop 37, it's flawed, it's costly, and it should be defeated on November 6th.
Okay. So who's funding the opposition to Proposition 37, and what is their interest in defeating the ballot measure?
Well, there are a number of groups that are interested in defeating Proposition 37. Our coalition of groups that oppose the measure include virtually the entire agriculture community in California. 80,000 family farmers based in our state oppose Proposition 37 because it will add new regulations, new burdens on them. The entire grocery retail community is opposed to Proposition 37 because they are going to be the first hit with lawsuits, and it's primarily the grocery retailers, the grocery stores, the markets, the ethnic markets that are tasked with complying with these regulations and making sure that food is properly labeled. So the first entity that the lawyers will sue will be grocery retailers, even if they're doing everything right. Also opposed to Proposition 37 are scientists, researchers, doctors, and Nobel Prize winners, Nobel laureates, business groups, taxpayer groups, community groups also oppose Proposition 37 because they have concerns about the lawsuits, about the additional bureaucratic red tape in California, but most importantly, the higher costs that will be passed on to consumers at the grocery checkout line.
Okay. And then this also includes grocery manufacturers and the biotech companies, right?
Right. Yes, they're opposed to Proposition 37 as well, absolutely, because they along with the grocery retailers, along with the family farmers, and really anyone associated with the food product can be hit with a meritless shakedown lawsuit, even if they're following the law, even if they're doing right. That doesn't protect, even if they're doing everything right, they are not protected from getting hit with a meritless claim because there's no proof needed to allege that someone is violating the law, and Proposition 37 doesn't even require the trial lawyers filing a lawsuit to show any damages. No one even needs to be hurt, or they don't have to show any damages prior to filing a lawsuit. This measure makes it very, very easy to file a lawsuit, and then it's up to the entity sued, whether it be the small Latino market on the corner or the big grocery store or the food company or the farmer. If they're sued, they're left with a choice, essentially. Do I spend tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars and many years proving myself innocent in court, or do I simply try to settle with the other attorney so that I can, save some money, save some time, and make this case go away. And we see that a lot in California. There are a lot of predatory trial lawyers. There are a lot of good lawyers who do good things, but there are also a lot of lawyers here in the state who take advantage of existing law and work it to their advantage so that they can quickly generate a settlement, get their attorney's fees and costs, and move on to the next one. And that's what we see happening with Proposition 37. And frankly, that's what 41 editorial boards also saw. The newspaper editorial boards in California are overwhelmingly against Proposition 37, and many of them called out the enforcement provisions as their number one concern because they recognize that innocent people could get sued, and that at the end of the day, it just drives up costs for consumers, and it drives up grocery prices. So
just to be clear about the lawsuit part, this has been one of those points of contention between the yes and the no camps. So under the provisions of the measure, so that they can sue if there's no evidence, even if there's no evidence of damage, and then if, let's say, the person who sues wins the case, then the person who loses has to pay all their court costs, right? But they don't get any extra reward on top of that, do they?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. This actually allows for damages. I know that the Yes on 37 campaign likes to pretend that it doesn't, but the measure allows for damages. And the way it would work, and attorney's fees and costs. And this is why this will be such a powerful tool to strong arm a settlement out of people who get sued, is because the law allows trial lawyers to go back 3 years and sue a grocery store or anybody for 3 years worth of that product sold. So, for example, a grocery store is carrying cereal that is unlabeled, and it will likely be unlabeled because it has no GE. Most companies will follow the law, and I think the Yes on 37 campaign would agree that companies are going to follow the law. If this passes, they'll either label their products and keep the same ingredients, or they'll switch out all their GE ingredients and go to non-GE, whether it's organic or whatever. They'll switch it out, and then they won't need to label because the measure says that if there's no GE, you don't need a label. What this measure allows lawyers to do, though, is to go into the grocery store, identify a box of cereal, let's say, or granola bars or something. It won't have a label, and the reason would be because all the GE is gone, following the law, doing everything right, but because the lawyers don't need to have any proof, they can file a lawsuit saying, we believe that this unlabeled product contains genetically engineered ingredients. It has no label, but it has corn in it, or it has soybean oil in it, or it has canola oil, or some other GE product that could be GE, but in this case isn't. They can say, we think it's GE, we're going to sue you, and we're going to go back 3 years for each product that you've sold. So it's a box of cereal. Each box of cereal is $4, let's say. You've sold 10,000 boxes of those cereal, 10,000 boxes of that particular cereal in the last 3 years, because the statute of limitations is 3 years. That's $40,000. Plus, we're going to seek attorney's fees and costs. And now it's up to the grocery store to say, okay, so $40,000 times the attorney's fees and costs. Can I settle this suit for less? And that is the problem with Proposition 37, because the attorneys can file this suit without doing any testing. They don't need to do any testing to determine if there's GE in that unlabeled product. They can simply go to court, get an injunction, and they've written this measure to change the requirements needed to get an injunction, to severely lower the bar, making it easy for them to get that injunction, and then it just becomes a matter of how much is it going to cost to defend myself and prove my innocence, or is it just more cost-effective, less time-consuming to settle out of court. And this is, again, what we've seen over and over in California, is these lawyers take advantage of these laws, and they file suits knowing all they care about is getting a settlement, and that the companies will think, well, it's cheaper, it's less expensive for me to settle. I'd rather deal with that than, I'd rather run my business. I'd rather get this out of my hair, and they just settle out of court.
Okay. Well, let's talk some more about some of the cost issues. Your campaign has claimed that the labeling scheme could cost consumers up to $400 a year in increased food costs. So what is that calculation based on?
The calculation is based on what food companies could do if Proposition 37 passes. They will essentially have two options. Either they keep the same ingredients and they label their products and they sell them in California. Remember, this is a state, this is a California-only measure. This doesn't impact any other state in the nation, just California.
Mm-hmm.
So,
or at least by law it doesn't impact, but it could still impact.
If the food companies decide to sell a labeled product outside California, which
mm-hmm.
is very unlikely. They haven't done that anywhere else. In fact, in other countries, they've attempted to get underneath the threshold so that they don't have to label, which is why it's more likely that option 2 is what would likely happen, and that is change out their GE ingredients and switch to higher-priced organic or higher-priced conventionally grown or higher-priced certified non-GE, use those in the products and not label. And to make that switch, it's going to be very, very costly, between $4.5 and $5.2 billion a year to source all these non-GE ingredients, because as you know, most of the canola, most of the soybean oil, most of the corn in the United States most of the sugar beets or 50%, are GE. So it's going to be expensive to source non-GE ingredients. That will drive up the cost. So if the food companies seek to avoid the labeling and switch out all their GE ingredients, this will be very, very expensive, again, between $4.5 and $5.2 billion a year. If you translate that down into how many households are in California, we come up with a figure of between $350 to $400 per year. Now, that doesn't even include the cost of the regulations heaped on farmers who will have to then pass that up the food chain. That doesn't include the settlement costs that will increase the cost of doing business for everyone from the family farmer all the way up to the grocer. Those two will be passed on to the consumer. So it's likely that it could even be more costly than that. But it's tough to come up with an estimate of how many lawsuits will be filed and all that sort of thing. We can look to what happened with Proposition 65, which is the previous measure written by Attorney James Wheaton, who also drafted Proposition 37. He himself has made $10 million from suing companies under the terms of Proposition 65 just in the last 10 years. Overall, we know that settlements from the Prop 65 litigation have amounted to $500 million, $500 million in settlements, and 75 to 80% of that $500 million has gone to attorneys' fees and costs. So you can see that these types of laws are very, very lucrative for lawyers, and it's not likely that they will ignore that opportunity to rake in a bunch of money. And if we look to how lawyers behave in California, the ones that take advantage of these types of laws, as I mentioned, there are lawyers who are doing good work, obviously, but then there are others who take advantage of these types of situations. And it's unrealistic to expect that they won't do the same here, especially since the author of Proposition 65 is an attorney who has done this in the past and who wrote a previous ballot measure that allowed these types of lawsuits in the past.
Okay, so about the calculation, so the $400, $350 to $400 figures based upon switching out ingredients to avoid the labels. But what sort of costs would companies and farmers and grocers and stuff like that incur if they were just to go with the labeling and not switch out ingredients?
We estimate that to be between $300 million and $800 million a year in California, because we don't find it likely that the companies will sell labeled products that are only required in California outside the state. Thus, they would need to set up separate packaging and distribution and processing facilities to serve the California market only. So it becomes very expensive no matter which option you look at. Obviously, the other option, switching out the ingredients, is where the real cost comes in.
So, if, let's say, companies were to mostly go with just labeling and not switching out the ingredients, mostly, for one thing, non-genetically engineered ingredients that are, sort of certified to be non-genetically engineered cost more, and organic food costs more. Yes, one of our blog contributors has suggested that a lot of non-GE ingredients could be sourced from China because they produce more non-GE than we do, since a lot of the commodities here are genetically engineered. But so with those difficulties of sourcing all those ingredients, it seems to me to be more likely that the companies would go with labeling it. So I mean,
well, they haven't done that in other countries.
I see.
That's the issue, and the labeling requirements in other countries are vastly different from Proposition 37. By 2019, in Proposition 37, in order to avoid a label, the threshold you can't have any GE in the product whatsoever. In Europe, the threshold is 0.9%, and in Japan, the threshold is 0.5%. So it's very, very different in California. California's Prop 37 would have a 0% threshold. So, again, that takes away some of the leeway for food manufacturers.
Well, I mean, in actuality, you can't actually certify anything as being 0% anything, so that would actually make it rather difficult, I would think. I mean, because
that's another issue. You're right.
Any scientific test. Any scientific test you do would actually, give you here's how, or a threshold is, and we can only go down this far, this many nanograms per kilogram, and but that's not 0. Yeah, that's an interesting other issue. So I mean, but I mean, I know that there are companies that do sell labeled, contains genetically engineered stuff in other countries where labeling is required. I mean, there are a lot of countries out there that do require labeling, different regulations, different thresholds, stuff like that.
Right.
But I mean, research has shown that people don't read the label if it's in the ingredient list and in that sort of area. Most people don't. And
that's not what Proposition 37 requires, though. Mm-hmm. Proposition 37 says the labels must be clear and conspicuous on the front or the back of the package.
Yeah.
And again, that's seen by consumers as a warning signal or a signal that something is different, unhealthy, changed in the food. And that, as you know from looking at the scientific evidence is very clear that by the time the bioengineered or GE or GMO ingredients wind up in our food, our bodies process them the same as they do for their traditional counterparts, whether that be organic or conventionally grown or whatever. Our bodies don't know the difference. So it's this is the problem with Proposition 37. It's a requirement that is misleading to consumers, and at the end of the day, they're given incorrect information or left with incorrect assumptions about the food, I should say, and that's a problem. I mean, that's not a policy based on fact. That's not a policy based on scientific evidence. It's a policy based on fear-mongering, and is why, frankly, the LA Times called the Yes on 37 campaign shameful for using weapons-grade junk science in promoting Proposition 37 and seeking to scare people into supporting the measure when there should be no fear. And over and over and over, scientists have looked at GE crops and biotech crops and found them to be safe. And in fact, just last week, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the publishers of Science magazine here in the United States,
AAAS.
AAAS issued a statement that came out against mandatory labeling of GE foods, and they restated numerous times in here that the foods are safe, and in fact said the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the British Royal Society, and every other respected organization that has examined the evidence has come to the same conclusion. Consuming foods containing ingredients derived from GM crops is no riskier than consuming the same foods containing ingredients from crop plants modified from conventional plant improvement techniques. So the science is on our side, and this is a measure that purports to do one thing, but really is about other things. It's about enriching trialers, giving them an opportunity to file more meritless shakedown lawsuits to encourage quick settlements and cash in their pockets. It's about a measure that increases state regulations. It's a measure that will burden family farmers here in California and put them at a competitive disadvantage with their counterparts in other states or even in other countries. And it's a measure that also includes a whole bunch of exemptions for foods that can contain GE ingredients. And these exemptions are not put in here for policy reasons. They were included or exempted for political reasons, because the drafter did not want to take on the alcohol industry or the restaurant industry or the dairy industry or the meat industry. So this is a measure that, was drafted in, back rooms among, a lawyer who put pen to paper and put this thing together and submitted it to the Attorney General, and it's just very, very badly flawed. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, more than 40 newspapers in California have looked at Prop 37, and they've come down on the side of urging their readers to reject it. Some of them are even papers that support labeling, but they've looked at the details in Prop 37 and they realize it's bad news for California. I mean, we've got paper, the LA Times says no on Prop 37. They called it sloppily written. The San Francisco Chronicle acknowledged that it could become a legal nightmare for those who grow, process, or sell food. The Sacramento Bee called it a classic example of an initiative that shouldn't be on the ballot, and said even voters who worry about genetically modified food should reject Prop 37.
Well, one of the things on that note I think is rather interesting about the proposition is that it doesn't actually tell you what is in there. It tells you what may have been used to produce, but because it's just sort of going off of a paper trail, it's not really telling you what is in there, what's the trait. So it doesn't really give you the what, and it also, it doesn't give you that kind of certainty about whether or not it is in there. I mean, but I'd like to talk about the science in a moment. I just have a couple quick questions about the issue of costs, if we could go through them. So, like, if the companies were to just go with the labels, and even if there was a segregating between labeled stuff sold in California and unlabeled stuff sold in other states, I mean, how would that compare for what the potential increase in food costs would be? How would that compare to the switching out the ingredient scheme?
We think that the cost, if food companies decided to label and keep the same ingredients, label their product, they would ship them to California only. This would be between $300 million to $800 million a year.
I see.
The
so
other cost,
about how much would that be per person on average in California?
We didn't break that down. I mean, I can get my calculator out and do the math quickly, but we believe that the other scenario is far more likely because we look at what has happened in other countries. And again, the food companies have generally sought to avoid labeling, and so they've worked to change out the ingredients and get within the threshold.
I mean, since you're saying for other countries, the U.S. is different. Perceptions of genetically engineered crops are different in the U.S. than in other countries, especially like Europe, for example. I mean, there was a poll that I described in detail on the Biofortified blog that that showed that when asked directly, would you eat a plant knowing it was genetically engineered, 60% of people said yes. It was 40% for animals and fish. Of course, strange that fish is an animal, but they sort of separated those two out. But 60% still said yes, and if I think the food manufacturers knew this, they'd be perhaps less inclined to try to switch things out, except for the issues of the potential lawsuits or other costs like that. But
that again, I want to keep going back to that because really we're not voting on one component of Proposition 37. We're voting on its entirety, and this measure is a mess. This measure has a whole bunch of different provisions that have nothing to do with what the Yes on 37 campaign likes to talk about. I mean, this measure allows private citizens to sue to enforce the law with no proof of an allegation, with no proof of damages, and it makes it very easy that these lawsuits can be filed and approved by the courts. Thus, it makes it very easy to shake down those who get sued and shake them down for a quick settlement so that the lawyers can get their attorney's fees and costs, they can get some damages, and move on to the next guy. And that really is a problem. I mean, if you can imagine operating a business and having the threat of this type of litigation hanging over your head day after day after day, that you could be sued for violating this law with no proof, even though you're doing everything right and you are following the law. And it's one thing to allow people to sue alleging a violation when they have facts or when they have proof, but Proposition 37 allows a lawsuit to go forward, allows an attorney to gain an injunction in court prohibiting the sale of that product with no proof that anyone has done anything wrong and no proof of damages.
Okay,
so it's a terrible climate in which to operate.
Yeah, I mean, it could make some things more difficult. So the but if like the cost is going to be more, more like the just the tracking and the record keeping and switching out the labels and that sort of stuff, it could be less than $400 per person per year. And do you think that by emphasizing the $400 figure, even though you think that is the more likely one, could make people just overly fearful of the cost implications, at least just the direct ones like that?
I'm not sure what your question is.
Oh, I could rephrase.
We're presenting people with a realistic cost estimate, how Proposition 37 could impact them over the course of 1 year at the grocery store. It doesn't even factor into the equation the additional costs for the grocery retailers who do have to maintain the paperwork, as you said, who are exposed to lawsuits, as we've talked about. And that, too, will add on to the cost of doing business in California. And regulations, additional requirements are, passed on by businesses to the people who buy their products. And in this case, everyone associated with a food product, everyone on the food chain is going to be forced to pass those costs up the chain. And in the end, it's the consumer who pays those costs. And that's one of the things we want to keep, we want people to keep in mind, is that Proposition 37 is going to cost more, is going to raise food costs. There's absolutely no question about it. And it's a part of Proposition 37 that people need to keep in mind. And, we're asking them to take a hard look at Proposition 37, to look into the details, look into the facts, and determine if they want to live in a post-Prop 37 California. And I think what we're seeing, at least in some of the public polling, is that people are looking into the details. They're looking at their editorials in their newspapers. They're evaluating Prop 37 on their own. They're reading the ballot pamphlet. They're reading news stories, and they're not really liking what they see. And, we keep making the case this is not just a simple little old labeling measure. This isn't just about adding a few drops of ink to a label to put a few words on the packaging. It's far, far more complicated and far more pernicious than that.
Okay. So let's talk about the science before you have to go. So you mentioned about, you said the science is on your side. I mean, I can certainly say that the weight of the scientific literature shows that these foods are not inherently risky. Your campaign has emphasized that. However, it seems like the primary focus has been pointing out potential economic costs of the proposition and, the law stuff, lawyer things as well, and not with necessarily educating people about genetic engineering itself. Couldn't some of the many, I guess it's been tens of millions of dollars spent fighting this proposition have perhaps a better impact through educational and outreach efforts?
Well, but this is a measure about Proposition 37. I mean, that's what voters are going to be evaluating in in 1 week today.
Yeah.
That's the measure on the ballot. And, we've got a very big state in California. We've got lots of voters. We've got lots of media markets. And it's important to ensure that voters everywhere understand Proposition 37. And as I mentioned, they're reading up on it. They're reading the No on 37 editorials that have run in nearly, I should say, every single daily paper in California, and they all have pointed out the measure's flaws. And that's the important thing, is that Proposition 37 is a flawed measure. It's sloppily drafted, according to the LA Times. It's a mess, according to the Riverside Press Enterprise. I mean, these are the things that voters need to understand about Prop 37. It's not just a simple labeling measure.
Okay. So, I mean, it seems like this wouldn't necessarily be something for your campaign to answer because you are trying to defeat this measure. But I mean, the more something for the organizations that support your campaign. But it seems like there's a potential missed opportunity if there's this much resources to discuss this topic. It seems like there'd be that much and more resources to help educate people about this topic in general. I mean, if the labels did end up happening, if Proposition 37 did pass, it seemed like there would be a need for large educational efforts to help people understand and put these ingredients in context. I'm wondering, though, if you might, have any thoughts on what kinds of labels some of your supporters might even support in the future. I mean, as you said, Proposition 37 is more than just a label. It's all these other things as well, all these other provisions. But, I mean, do you think there might be some forms of GE labeling that people, even your supporters, might support?
Well, that's, I think, a discussion for after Proposition 37. As you mentioned, I'm working to defeat Proposition 37. I represent the entire coalition of California and other companies that are opposed to the measure because of its all of its provisions. And obviously this discussion is going to continue beyond Prop 37.
One way or another.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so I guess finally, what is something you think has been lost in the discussion over this ballot measure? Something that both your campaign and the campaign opposed to the a campaign in favor of the proposition agree upon?
Let's see. I don't know. I think we both we agree that the proposition exempts out. Includes a number of exemptions. We disagree as to why that's the case. I've heard Stacy make the case that the measure, we had to deal with signal subject issues, untrue. We wanted to make this like Europe, also not relevant, or I don't even know if it's true or not. Too complicated. We had to start somewhere. I've heard a whole bunch of different reasons for the different exemptions, but the fact of the matter is Prop 37 doesn't even include in its requirements 2/3 of the foods we eat every day, and we're talking about foods that can contain GE ingredients. They exempted restaurant food, they exempted alcohol, they exempted dairy, they exempted meat, so it sets up a very strange situation. Also, foreign food coming in from other countries is exempt as long as the shipment of food contains a letter or a sworn statement saying that the food is unlabeled because it's GE-free, and there are no checks, no requirements to ensure that the foreign entities shipping food into California are actually being truthful in that statement, and so it sets up a situation where the foreign producers, if they're unscrupulous, they could violate the law, and consumers could be eating GE without even knowing it if it's coming from an unscrupulous foreign producer.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for participating in this discussion. And in your final week, good luck with your campaign.
Okay, thanks very much, Carl.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
That was Kathy Fairbanks from the No on 37 Stop the Deceptive Food Labeling Scheme campaign at www.noprop37.com. I hope you enjoyed these interviews, and I hope that you learned something about this proposition, its supporters, and its critics, just as I did. I learned that the idea that making widespread changes in how food is recorded, tracked, and labeled couldn't possibly cost nothing, nor would it likely cost $400 per person every year. Strangely, the proponents, when pressed, admit that this kind of tracking would be costly with one category of food, but do not acknowledge that the same would be true for the other foods covered by the proposition. On the other side, the opposition sticks to the idea that companies will change all their ingredients to avoid the labels, when many may just add the labels whether or not there are GE ingredients at all. There is little independent information to help people who are undecided figure out what the long-term impact will be. Thankfully, at least, the opponents of the proposition provided a figure for how much they estimate just the tracking, record-keeping, and relabeling would cost, $800 million. With 37 million Californians, that's about $9 to $22 per year. That's not a whole lot per person, but it would likely be the bare minimum cost for the average Californian. It could be more, and I'm no economist, but it will probably not be as much as $400. It will definitely not be zero. With imperfect knowledge, should we invoke the precautionary principle? I am, however, a scientist. Some people are concerned that genetically engineered crops are dangerous, yet there are literally hundreds of published peer-reviewed studies that support their safety, and about a third of these are independent of corporate dollars. Political goals, whether they touch on global warming, evolution education, or genetically engineered crops, should never be attained by cherry-picking the science you like and ignoring the consensus that you don't like. While opponents may have gone overboard on estimating the economic risks, the proponents of the proposition went too far in claiming health risks as a reason to label these foods. And people who want to avoid them can do so by looking for products from companies that already track their ingredients, label as non-GE or non-GMO, and even test them to be sure. This political debate has gone on for years, and you can tell. Both sides, when asked about what they agree upon, had a hard time coming up with something that was not a jab at the other side. And I sent this question in advance. I'll close by saying that I believe in a person's right to know about their food, but my definition of this might differ from the way it has been used in this political contest. What I mean is, I believe in a person's right to understand their food. That is true knowledge. I believe that people should have the right to have information available that will help them understand how their food came to their dinner tables, from how it was farmed and processed to how its genetics have been modified by breeding, genetic engineering, and everything in between. And I believe that misinformation, even when provided to support a political goal that is honestly held, harms that right to understand one's food. Neither side seems as interested in this goal as I think they should be. We need a better dialogue, not more political debate. Food is a beautiful thing, but politics is ugly. And so food politics makes for a weird combination. Next week, California voters will decide on Proposition 37. I would like to thank my guests, Stacy Malkan and Kathy Fairbanks, for joining me in this discussion. I would also like to thank readers who submitted questions for these interviews. I'm Karl Haro von Mogel from the Biofortified blog at www.biofortified.org/blog, and thanks for listening.